This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 808 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Last week's sleeper show was actually pretty good. On the bad side, Matthew Stafford wasn't that great of a streamer. Kendre Miller didn't see the workload that I thought he might see. Josh Reynolds did absolutely nothing, quite literally. Roschon Johnson and the Bears continued to be bad. Zach Ertz didn't do much, and neither did Taysom Hill. But there were a lot of positives last week. CJ Stroud came through as a strong play. So did his wide receiver, Tank Dell, who had a top 10 performance. Tutu Atwell was a top 20 wideout. Adam Thielen was the wide receiver 3 on the week. Jerick McKinnon was a top 10 running back. Jake Ferguson was a tight end 1. Even Rico Dowdle, he had a big performance. He was the RB17 in PPR formats. Considering the types of players that I'm talking about on this show, I'll take those results. Let's try to keep it up here in week 4. Things are tougher this week than last, I'm not going to lie. But we'll begin by looking at players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, and as usual, we're going to start at quarterback, and I'm going to go back to CJ Stroud. Now, I'm not necessarily in love with his matchup this week against Pittsburgh. The Texans have their fair share of offensive line issues right now, and Pittsburgh is not Jacksonville. The Jags, Stroud's opponent last week, they've been the 26th ranked team in pressure rate this year defensively. Pittsburgh ranks 11th. Even still, the Steelers are a bottom half team in passing EPA allowed per dropback to start the year. And they've been completely average in adjusted fantasy points allowed. It's a tough week for quarterback streamers, and that's also partially elevating Stroud here. Another streamer I like is Jimmy Garoppolo. Now, he is in concussion protocol right now as I say this, so he might not go this week. But if he does go, you have to like this spot against the Chargers. That game has a better total than the aforementioned Steelers-Texans game. And the Chargers are a top 5 team so far this year in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. On top of that, like I said on the 10 Trends episode, Jimmy G is kind of airing it out. He's top 5 in air yards per attempt, and he has the second highest rate of throwing at 15 plus air yards. So you can play him as a streamer if he ends up going. Now moving on to running back, I'm going to assume that Devon Achane, which is what he wants to go by now, that he's not available in your league. So I'm going to skip over him. You're most likely playing him if you have him. I'm going to kick things off here though with Roschon Johnson. The gap between Roschon and Khalil Herbert, it shrunk a little bit last week on the snap share front. Roschon played 45% of Chicago's snaps. Herbert was at 55%. The week prior, there was a 19% difference. Chicago might be able to move the ball this week against Denver because everyone's been able to move the ball against Denver. The Broncos are currently the worst team in football against running backs and adjusted fantasy points allowed. We saw what Miami did to them last week. And they've allowed the 3rd highest adjusted target share to running backs. That's how the Bears deploy Roschon Johnson. So there's a chance that he has an okay outing. Now, I do think that Matt Breida is a much safer play and better play than Roschon Johnson, as long as Saquon Barkley's out. Breida gets Seattle. Seattle's the 8th best matchup for running backs so far this year and adjusted fantasy points allowed. More importantly than the matchup, though, is Breida's usage. The Giants offense had a really hard time last week doing anything offensively against San Francisco. But Breida played the most snaps in that backfield by far. He had an 82% snap share. In a much better matchup, he could get it done in week 4. And speaking of that game, in week 3, we saw decent Elijah Mitchell usage. In a positive game script for the 49ers, Mitchell finished the day with a 33% running back rush share and a 9% target share. There's nothing wrong with that when you're looking for guys off the waiver wire to play, especially in a good offense. This week, the 49ers get the Cardinals. Arizona's been playing better than expected, yes. But San Francisco is a 14-point favorite. That's according to FanDuel Sportsbook. They may end up riding their backups more than usual in a game like this, and that would favor Elijah Mitchell. At wide receiver, Tank Dell is still under that 50% mark. He's an easy go-to this week. He saw an uptick in snaps over the last 2 weeks with Noah Brown's injury. And Noah Brown is not getting that job back. Dell has given us 2 top 20 performances in PPR leagues so far this year, and he's seen a 23% and 24% target share over his last 2 games. Now he gets Pittsburgh, a top 5 advantageous matchup when it comes to schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So Dell is a solid play in week 4. Both Chargers wide receivers, I'm talking about Josh Palmer and Quentin Johnston, they're under that 50% mark still, at least at the time of this recording. I'm sure those numbers will jump up a little bit, but regardless, they make for fine enough plays against Vegas. I'm expecting Josh Palmer to be on the field more than Quentin Johnston because that's what we've seen so far this season. So Palmer makes a lot more sense than QJ here in week 4. But they get the Raiders. Vegas has been okay against wideouts this year, but it's a beatable secondary. A huge reason they've been fine in fantasy points against is because they rank dead last or first, depending on how you want to look at it, in adjusted target share allowed to wideouts. Teams have not been targeting their wide receivers that frequently against the Raiders. Now that may not change. Those numbers are adjusted for opponent. We might see this Chargers team not target their wide receivers as heavily. But right now, the Chargers have the second highest wide receiver target share in the league. They're still going to attack the perimeter. They're still going to use their wide receivers. And that's going to be helpful for both Josh Palmer and Quentin Johnston. Like I said, I would play Palmer over Johnston, but if you're in a pinch, I understand going with Johnston. DJ Chark is coming off a game where he saw 19% of Carolina's targets, scoring 18.6 PPR points. And let's just be honest for a second. Right now, today, at this moment, Andy Dalton is better for this team's fantasy production than Bryce Young. Today. Chark and the Panthers get the Vikings this week. They've been the third best opponent so far this year in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. And they entered the season with a poorly ranked secondary. Now, I would be playing Adam Thielen over DJ Chark. But I do think he's viable after playing more snaps than any other Panthers wideout in week 3. The Tennessee Titans do not have a good pass defense. They're first in air yards per attempt allowed. They're a bottom 10 team at defending the pass according to EPA per dropback. They've had decent success at getting to the quarterback, but they've been much better against the run than the pass. They're actually 4th in the league in rushing yards over expected per rush allowed. They've been good against the run, but they're not so good against the pass. Teams against Tennessee are likely to find success through the air. Cleveland found success in week 3. The Chargers did in week 2. Derek Carr in week 1 had over 300 yards. Now it's the Bengals. I don't usually love Tyler Boyd in fantasy football, and I don't think that he's some smash play, but he does have a 17% target share on the season. And he's run a route on at least 86% of Joe Burrow's dropbacks in every single game. Tennessee has been pretty average against the slot this season, but overall this matchup, it's good for the Bengals passing attack. Now moving on, let's look at some tight ends. I love Luke Musgrave this week. As I've mentioned, he's been top 6 in route participation this season at tight end, and he's top 15 in target share as a rookie tight end. The Packers get the Lions this week, and Detroit's been a top 5 matchup for tight ends so far this year in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Luke Musgrave makes a ton of sense. And then I think Gerald Everett makes sense as a streamer too. I know Donald Parham has been stealing some touchdowns, but Everett's been the one who's seen higher route participation each week this season. There's no Mike Williams for the Chargers anymore. That could lead to more tight end usage in that passing game. Everett has a 10.2% target share on the season. That's not anything special. But the matchup is at least there against Vegas. I prefer Luke Musgrave, but I do think that Everett makes sense as a deeper play. This section of the show features players rostered in fewer than 10% of leagues, so we're digging pretty deep. I've got a quarterback to call out first. It's Andy Dalton. That's how deep we're digging. And this is assuming that Bryce Young doesn't go, of course. That's not 100% certain at all at the time of this recording. But Dalton looked competent last week, and he was actually not a bad quarterback last season. He wasn't some fantasy football stud, but PFF actually gave Dalton a top 6 passing grade last year. He was able to support Panthers pass catchers last week, and he's in an even better spot this week against Minnesota. The Vikings have struggled against opposing quarterbacks in fantasy to start the year, giving up the 6th most adjusted points to the position. So you could do worse than Andy Dalton this week if he does indeed start. Now, finding running backs in the less than 10% range this week, absolutely brutal. So tough. I'm going to go with Latavius Murray here, but I'm not saying that with a lot of confidence. This is really just playing on the fact that Murray has seen a 21% and 25% route participation over the last 2 weeks. He clearly has an edge over Damian Harris. In this game against Miami, it's interesting because it could be high scoring. Now, I like James Cook, but Latavius Murray leads that Bills backfield with 4 goal line rushes this year. So maybe he's able to fall into the end zone within this good environment this weekend. At wide receiver, Darius Slayton, he's kind of in an interesting spot this week. He's run by far the most routes for the Giants to start the season, and he's seen a respectable 18% target share. The Giants really haven't gotten things going offensively, though. But I don't think that's all that surprising when in week 1, they faced the Cowboys, and week 3, it was the 49ers. This week, it's Seattle. The Seahawks have allowed the most air yards in the league to start the season. They're bottom 5 at expected points added per dropback allowed. That's resulted in them being the best matchup for wide receivers right now in adjusted fantasy points allowed. I wish that I could recommend Wan'Dale Robinson. You just can't play him right now after running just 8 routes last week. So I'll play it safe and go with Darius Slayton. Another veteran that you could look at is Curtis Samuel. Samuel's played 72% of his snaps from the slot to start the year while running the 3rd most routes for the Commanders, obviously behind Jahan Dotson and Terry McLaurin. He probably won't be on the field in many 2-wide sets, but the Commanders could end up trailing big this weekend because they get a good Philadelphia team. The Eagles are 8.5-point favorites according to FanDuel Sportsbook. Philly also sees their targets against them get funneled to the slot at a higher than normal rate. They were one of the top teams in football last year in slot target percentage allowed, and they're already 2nd this season. That could bode well for someone like Curtis Samuel and a negative game script. Now, Samuel's only seen a 13% target share this year. This is definitely a deep play, but I think it's logical given the matchup. And then at tight end, the options in this tier are horrible. I'm just going to throw Cade Otton out there because he's 12th in the league in route participation to start the season, and his target share is okay at 12.5%. I don't feel great about the matchup because New Orleans has been good against the position in recent years. But that's where we're at with these bottom-of-the-barrel tight ends. People have caught on, and the players like Luke Musgrave are rostered in too many leagues to be recommended here. Now quickly, for streaming defenses, I think Denver's in play against Justin Fields and the Bears. It's obviously a riskier play, but I do think it makes sense. On the year, defenses against Chicago are scoring 5.6 more standard points than they typically score. Seattle against the New York Giants, they work too. I don't think they're a smash play, but the Seahawks, for as bad as that secondary's been, they've been top half in the league in pressure rate. And the Giants have been a good matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed. And then you could also try to take advantage of Jameis Winston starting for the Saints and go with the Bucks. That game is an ugly 40.5-point over-under, and the Bucks are only 3-point underdogs. Tampa Bay's defense has been fairly average to start the year, but the matchup is okay enough to use them here in week 4. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. And remember to check out the Late Round Fantasy Football Instagram account at LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Mailbag Show and a new Late Round Perspectives episode.